AI news, everyone! AI news! AI! Yay! Right. Now that festivities are out of the way, it's come to my attention that a lot of organizations don't know how to measure return on investment with AI usage. I find that personally fascinating as somebody who's learning entrepreneurship and somebody who has been in the technical and non-technical fields. First off, my name's Danny. I was a DevOps engineer. I use AI in my daily workflows. I understand AI more or less in terms of what it can do. And on top of that, I'm currently studying project management and things of that nature. So why is this interesting to me? Because as somebody who's worked with software and currently studying project management, I have come to the conclusion that the metrics which are used to measure AI return on investment are fundamentally incorrect. What do I mean by this? Using metrics like pull requests, which have been generated from AI, right, and not favoring working solutions over things like documentation is fundamentally wrong. When I write software, one of the things that I do is I actually do the opposite. I actually include more documentation just to make sure that I'm reminded of how this particular bit of software works, especially when it comes to operational management. It's fundamental for me, because if I don't put that down, I will forget what that software is doing when I need to go back to it for things like debugging. Okay? Now in Scrum, we're told working solutions over documentation. It's not necessarily wrong, because the engineers are supposed to be looking at the code at the repository of the code and say, okay, this makes sense because of XYZ pattern. But not everybody understands or knows what that code does. Hence, I think it's actually more important to have documentation, especially as we introduce AI. So that's one metric. But the other metric, which I think is even more important, is unit testing and integration testing. Why? Because working solutions mean more. Now, a lot of people turn around and say, oh, well, having AI make the unit test and integration test is a bit like AI marking its own homework. It's only marking its own homework if you didn't understand the fundamentals in the first place. I'll repeat that because I've never seen anybody on LinkedIn, Instagram, or anybody else say this. Yeah, it's only wrong if you did not understand the fundamentals that you are measuring in the first place. Yeah, having a unit or integration test around a 302 redirect is fundamentally different than saying, oh, does it return 200 okay, just because I can see it. No, that's a fundamentally different request that you're asking AI to achieve. Yeah? So if you want working software, have unit and integration tests. And then measure it. Get the output. Say, okay, well, what happens within my CI/CD pipeline? Right? Is it actually failing due to XYZ problem? That is a lot more useful than saying, okay, well, I don't actually know what's going on now, therefore I'll just release the software because AI and investors. No. You make rubbish software. Garbage in equals garbage out. Why? Because AI is a predictability engine. Right? The more data it has in the data set alongside the neurons, right, which is called weighted, basically it's a multiplication of weighted data against each neuron equals resolution. Yeah? That's how AI works fundamentally. Right? Very, like strip everything away and you end up with that as the core. Right? Once we understand this, now we can get into ROI. Because now we understand it's predicting. And this is why I get a little bit confused as to why a lot of firms aren't hiring right now in terms of junior and senior understanding. Yeah? Because remember, the junior thinks in different ways to the senior, but also may have different ideas that the senior hasn't even thought of yet. So it's actually a benefit to the organization, and it's cheaper on labor. Okay, but that's a separate issue, which is not related to ROI of AI. When it comes back to ROI of AI, the one thing that's interesting is input and output tokens. Input and output tokens are interesting because they represent each unit of data that the AI has to process. Now, if you're using something like DeepSeek, which is open source, you don't necessarily need to worry about it if you're hosting it. But if it's on the cloud, like something like, what's the other one? Claude Code, if you're using something like that, Opus 4.8, if you're using, what's it called? The one from OpenAI called Codex, if you're using Codex, for example, then the calculations will be different, right? It just depends on where you're hosting the data. Now, what's interesting about that is if I go to my screen here and look for these tokens, right? So I'm going to do token use for Claude. Yep. Right, and bearing in mind you have a 5-hour window for when you'd use this stuff. I don't know why it says 5-hour window, but that comes with the Pro and Max subscriptions. But there is a per usage of tokens that you can use. So I think it's token cost even. There we go, token cost. And we will come and we'll show you this in a second. Let's use Claude as an example. Let's go to my display. There we go. So, see here, right? Claude API usage tokens. We have different ones for input and output. So I'm going to put down input and output token cost. And here we go. Right? Claude 5 Fable, which is the newest one, which I've talked about, is $10 an input, $50 per output on 1 million tokens. So what justifies a token? A token essentially is the amount of data that is within the context window. Now, if you're a manager wondering, okay, well, what on earth is a context window, right? Or an engineer, or somebody on my feed at the moment who builds applications, perhaps you're a founder, right? The context window is the amount of information put in Claude Code or something like that. So what I mean is this, right? If I go to my Visual Studio Code and I interact with, oh, this is a good example. Here we go. This was a project which I was working on, which I don't remember. What was this? This was, oh, right, yeah, this is a project which I'm working on for flights and stuff like that. So here we go. See, we got Fable 5 is already updated. But my context window here is literally based upon this, right? So the context window is basically here. So this is the context window. Everything that I'm typing now, this is context. Each word represents a token within the context window. And you'll see that as you use Claude Code, it will come up with the tokens which are being used for inputs, outputs, and thinking. This is a good measure of ROI. Because now I can say, right, okay, if I know how many millions of context I'm using, which I could easily get Claude Code to tell me, right? And you go back to the token usage, I now know how much money I'm spending. It makes sense, right? Per million input tokens, or output tokens, or thinking. Yeah? So if I've got loads of developers writing code all at the same time, I probably want a solution which tells me how many tokens am I using, how many was in thinking, how many were inputs, how many were outputs. And having that particular solution based upon the API calls is going to be what determines whether or not we use AI or whether or not we don't use AI, not having PRs all over the place. Because that's not going to make any sense. How else would I approach this? I would also say, I want to lock in my price for the subscription that I have for each developer at a certain price against the offset of the millions of tokens that we're spending each day. that is a better metric of ROI. Why? Because now I understand how much it will cost me in order to sell the product to the consumer and make a profit. The other one that I'm also looking at is how much time did it take us to build the system and get it in front of customers and pass the unit tests. Very, very important stuff. Because if we don't know that, how can we justify what we're building? What is the business case? Did the solutions architect go through what we already know? Right? Like I said, I'm studying project management. These are things which are incredibly important. Otherwise, how are we making any money? The business isn't going to survive this way. It needs to be on a for-profit basis. And knowing these costs are imperative. See? And this is where founders are winning. Founders are winning and making a mockery of this particular thing because they're able to understand that this is what's going on per the amount of tokens being spent. Yeah? So anyway, I hope that was useful. And I hope that's given you more insight as to some of the metrics that I would be using from a software engineering perspective, more precisely DevOps, but from that particular perspective in terms of how to marry that particular bit of engineering knowledge to project management. And saying, right, how will we deal with this project when we are faced with the uncertainty, right? Because remember, you guys have done VUCA, you project managers who are working at the moment, right? You have VUCA and you have Moscow, right? Must have, should have, could have, won't have, right? Volatility, complexity, right? All that sort of stuff. You know, as to how to deal with those particular things when it comes to AI. Yeah? So I probably just single-handedly saved the economy. Okay, I joke. I haven't done that, but anyway, you get the idea, right? This is how you create the return on investment. Because if you don't, you know, you can say bye-bye to your company. That's all I can say about that. I'm sorry, but it's a hard truth. I know a lot of people are not going to be very happy with that. But the truth is you can't disobey the laws of mathematics when it comes to spend. Yeah? And as somebody who has gone in and seen teams save every bit of money they can, right, when utilizing different methodologies, I can tell you that for a fact. Yeah? So there we go, right? There we go. It doesn't matter what type of model you're using. It doesn't matter if it's Codex. It doesn't matter if it's Claude. It doesn't matter if it's Gemini. It doesn't matter if it's, you know, you're using Amazon Bedrock. It doesn't matter if you're using SageMaker, right? Just to get these large language models to work, right? These AI models, because they're prediction engines at the end of the day. The point that I'm making is that a method of understanding cost is what's needed. In fact, I think I'm going to build a solution just for that. And if you want to see that, you know, if you want to see that, DM me in the comments, or better yet, follow me for more. All right, I'll see you soon.